Welcome to Wisdom Trek with Gramps. Wisdom is the final frontier in gaining true knowledge. Our mission is to create a legacy of wisdom, to seek out discernment and insights, and boldly grow where few have chosen to grow before. Hello, my friend. This is Gramps. Thanks for coming along with us on our journey to increase wisdom and create a living legacy. Today is day 1556 of our trek, and it is Worldview Wednesday. Creating a biblical worldview is essential to have a proper perspective on today's current events. To establish a biblical worldview, we must have a proper understanding of God and His Word. This week we will continue reviewing the book from Dr. Michael S Heiser titled Supernatural. The book is an abbreviated version of his more comprehensive book, The Unseen Realm. I highly recommend both of these books. Creating a biblical worldview based on how the Old and New Testament connects with God's overall plan for humanity is essential. This book review will help us to understand what the Bible teaches about the unseen world and why it matters. And today's chapter is Holy War. The Bible is a controversial book. People who don't see it as the Word of God often object to what it says. But some parts of the Bible make even Christians uncomfortable. Israel's war to conquer the Promised Land is a case in point. Why is that? Mostly because of all the killing. It seems indiscriminate and far too thorough. Why was it necessary to kill entire populations in some cities, men, women, and children, and even livestock? Why not let the inhabitants surrender? Wouldn't it be better to exile them than to slaughter them? There is an answer to those objections, but I've discovered that the answer seems to make Christians feel as uncomfortable as the problem. You can only understand the rationale and motive of the conquest accounts when you see them through a supernatural worldview of the Israelite. So we want to look at Israel's supernatural logic in this. The battles of the Promised Land were framed by two factors, both deeply rooted in Israel's understanding of their world as not only an abode for humankind, but also the prize in an unseen spiritual war. We've talked about both of them already, but let's review. One factor is the fallout from the events of the Tower of Babel when God decided, after the nations rebelled against Him, that He no longer wanted a direct relationship with the people of those nations. Instead, He assigned members of His divine councils, the sons of God, to govern them. And this can be found in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 19 through 20, and Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. Afterward, He called Abraham and enabled him and his wife Sarah to have a child, Isaac, from whom the people of Israel would come. We learned in Psalm 82 that these lesser gods became corrupt. They allowed injustice. People came to worship them instead of the Most High God. Thus, they became enemies of God and His people Israel. Since some of those nations were within the land of Canaan, which God had promised to give to the nation of Israel after the Exodus, Moses and the Israelites believed that these people who occupied those lands were mortal enemies and their gods would do all that they could to destroy Israel. A second factor is even more frightening for the Israelites. This is best explained at what happened when the Israelites arrived at the border of Canaan, the Promised Land. Moses sent 12 spies into Canaan to report on the land and its inhabitants. The spies came back with evidence that the land itself was wonderful. They said it flows with milk and honey, just as God had told them in Numbers chapter 32, verse 27. But then 10 spies dropped the bombshell in Numbers chapter 13, verses 32 through 33. Let me read that. So they spread a bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giant Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too. We've talked about Nephilim before. They were the sinister spawn of the sons of God and the daughters of humankind back in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. The Anakim giants with the Israelite spies saw in Canaan were their descendants. There were more of them scattered throughout the land of Canaan, among the nations and cities the Israelites would have to defeat to take the land. The task of conquering the land and its God seemed difficult before. Now it looked downright impossible. Now to take the land, they would have to face warriors of an abnormal physical size. Only 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, believed that God would help the Israelites defeat the Anakim. The rest persuaded the people that they would lose. Instead of trusting God, the same God who had devastated Pharaoh and his army so thoroughly would give them the victory, they whined, "We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are." Numbers chapter 13:31. But God replied in Numbers chapter 14, verse 11, "And the Lord said to Moses, How long will these people treat me with contempt? Will they never believe me, even after all the miraculous signs I have done among them?" God was so angry he threatened to disinherit Israel, the very thing he had done to the nations at the Tower of Babel, and then start all over again, this time with Moses. God said in Numbers chapter 14, verse 12, "I will disown them and destroy them with a plague. I will make you into a greater nation, greater and mightier than they are." Moses begged God to relent in Numbers chapter 14, verses 13 through 19. And God did, but he couldn't overlook the unbelief of the people. A lesson had to be learned. It would be harsh. He told Moses in Numbers chapter 14, verses 20 through 31, "Then the Lord said, I will pardon them as they have requested, but as surely as I live, and as surely as the earth is filled with the Lord's glory, not one of these people will ever enter the land. They have all seen my glorious presence and the miraculous signs I performed both in Egypt and in the wilderness, but again and again they tested me by refusing to listen to my voice. They will never see the land I swore to give their ancestors. None of those who have treated me with contempt will ever see it. But my servant Caleb has a different attitude than the others have. He has remained loyal to me, so I will bring him into the land he explored. His descendants will possess their full share of the land. Now turn around and don't go toward the land where the Amalekites and the Canaanites live. Tomorrow you must set out for the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea." Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "How long must I put up with this wicked community and its complaints about me? Yes, I have heard the complaints the Israelites are making against me. Now tell them this. As surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. You will drop dead in the wilderness. Because you complained against me, every one of you who was 20 years old or older and was included in the registration will die. You will not enter and occupy the land I swore to give you. The only exceptions will be Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. You said your children would be carried off as plunder. Well, I will bring them safely into the land, and they will enjoy what you have despised." To this point, God had been tolerant with the people's complaints. Instead of being thrilled to no longer be bondservants in Egypt, they griped about the food that they had to eat, and about God's chosen leader Moses. But his patience had run out. This time their unbelief would have a terrible cost. Israel would wander in the desert for 40 years until all of the adults who had not believed had died off. After that, God gave them a second chance. Israel would get a second chance at taking the promised land. Deuteronomy chapter 2 and 3 chronicles how, during the 40 years in the wandering, the Israelites wound up in the territory on the other side of the Jordan River, called the Transjordan, which was to the east of the promised land. The Transjordan lands were Edom, Moab, and Ammon, territories God had given to Lot's descendants, Abraham's nephew, and Esau, Jacob's brother. The people who lived there were relatives of the Israelites, most of them anyway, but there were others. After the 40 years of wandering, God had directed Moses to take this trip for a specific purpose. It wasn't about visiting distant relatives. The Israelites eventually made their way into the region known as Bashan. The place had a terrifying reputation. In ancient literature outside the Bible, Bashan was known as the place of the serpent. Two of the major cities were Ashtaroth and Edrei, both mentioned in connection with their journey. They were considered gateways to the underworld realm of the dead. In the context of Israel's supernatural worldview, God had led the Israelites to the gates of hell. And that wasn't all. God had brought the Israelites there to encounter two kings, Sihon and Og. These two kings were Amorites and rulers of what the Bible calls the Rephaim. As Deuteronomy chapter 2 verse 11 ominously notes, the Anakim were also counted as the Rephaim. God, through Moses, had led the people to encounter an area occupied by the same sort of giants that had frightened the Israelite spies into unbelief years earlier, the very events that caused the 40 years of wandering. Why had God brought them there? Because this confrontation was a foretaste of what would have to be done when the 40 years had ended. Israel would eventually have to cross the Jordan and occupy the land God had given them. God was testing the people. Would they believe and fight this time? If so, a victory would provide them the confidence and faith for what lay ahead. The Israelites had turned afraid years earlier, but this time the story ended differently, as Moses said in Deuteronomy chapter 2 verse 33 and chapter 3 verse 3. The Lord God gave Sihon over to us, and we defeated him and his sons and all the people. The Lord our God gave into our hands Og also, the king of Bashan, and all his people, and we struck them down until there was no survivor left." The prophet Amos recounted the confrontation in his own biblical book many years later. He described the outcome this way in Amos chapter 2, verse 9. "The Lord destroyed the Amorites before them, whose height was the height of the cedars, and who was as strong as oaks." It was a rough way to start their second chance. God demanded that they face their fears, the terrors that had cost them 40 years of aimless wandering. They had the God who had parted the Red Sea on their side. It was time that they remembered that. And that is why we get into the section called Devoted to Destruction. Israel won the day against Sihon and Og. Here we get our first taste of why the conquest of the Promised Land at times involved annihilation. The entire population of the cities that were home to the giant Rephaim were all voted to destruction. Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 6. The goal was not revenge. The goal was to ensure the elimination of the Nephilim bloodlines. To the Israelites, the giant clan bloodlines were demonic. Having been produced by the rebellious, fallen divine beings, they could not coexist with a demonic heritage. Time passed, and before the Israelites crossed the Jordan into Canaan, Moses died. The leadership passed to Joshua. He led many military campaigns in the Israelite conquest of the Promised Land. And those campaigns were guided by two factors I noted earlier in this chapter: to drive out the hostile nation enemies and, in the process, eliminate the giant clan bloodlines. Viewed in this context, the conquest of the Bible land was a holy war, a battle against the forces of darkness and the enemies under the dominion of hostile gods that the Bible says are real spiritual entities. The logic of the conquest is summarized well in Joshua chapter 11, verses 21 and 22. It says, "During this period, Joshua destroyed all the descendants of Anak who lived in the hill country of Hebron, Debir, and Anab, and the entire hill country of Judah and Israel. He killed them all and completely destroyed their towns. None of the descendants of Anak were left in all the land of Israel, though some still remained in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod." And we get to the section of why this matters. Joshua's campaigns were mostly successful, but not complete. A few giant clans escaped, and while it may not seem very important, it foreshadowed events to come. Some wound up in Gath. Gath was a Philistine city, Joshua chapter 13, verse 3, and was the hometown of Goliath at the time of King David, 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4. Goliath wasn't the only giant in Gath either, which can be found in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 5 through 8. Not all of those who had been devoted to destruction during the conquest of the Bible land were destroyed, and the fact that the conquest didn't accomplish all the prime directives had consequences for the Israelites. The book of Judges tells us that the conquest is incomplete in other ways at the time that Joshua died. It was never fully realized. The Israelites decided that they had done well enough and disobeyed God's command to drive out the other nations, but we know that partial obedience is really disobedience. The Israelites would spend centuries paying for their decision to stop short of God's goals. The book of Judges reiterates this awful cycle. Israel was repeatedly overwhelmed by hostile nations, and believing loyalty in God was nearly extinguished. Things did improve during the time of David and his son Solomon, but once Solomon was gone, Israel disintegrated into civil war and idolatry. The glory of the conquest was overshadowed by epic failure. Defeat was snatched from the jaws of victory. God's kingdom rule, his plan to restore Eden, went down in flames. The supernatural worldview that emerged from Babel, with the unbelieving nations under the dominion of evil gods, remained intact. Israel was defeated and scattered, and her promised land came under the rule of other gods and their peoples. This same worldview permeates the New Testament too. Paul uses terms like principalities, authorities, thrones, and powers to describe the forces of darkness. Each of those terms were used in antiquity to refer to geographical rule. The cause of the Israelites' failure was disobedience and faithlessness on the part of God's people. Humans are weak. We might even wonder why God bothers with us. But if we look back to Eden, we know why. God had committed himself to humanity. We are his imagers, his earthly family. His original plan for ruling earth included us. For God to cast aside human participation in his council rule on earth would send a message that he is unable to make it work, or that it was a bad idea to begin with. God is not incapable of achieving his own goals, and as mentioned in an earlier chapter, he doesn't make mistakes. It was time for a new approach to the old problem of sin and failure. Humanity could not be trusted for reviving the Edenic kingdom rule. Only God himself could do what was needed to be done. Only God could meet the obligations of his own covenant, but humanity would not be set aside. Instead, God would have to become human. God would have to fulfill the law and the covenants himself, and then take upon himself the penalty for human failure. But pulling off this unthinkable solution meant that it would have to be kept secret from everyone, including the intelligent supernatural beings hostile to his purposes. That wasn't going to be easy. And that will finish our study for this week's Worldview Wednesday. Join us again next week as we continue to build our worldview. Tomorrow, though, we'll ponder another bit of wisdom from Gramps. So encourage your friends and family to join us and to come along with us tomorrow for another day of Wisdom Trek, Creating a Legacy. If you'd like to listen to any of the past 1,555 treks or read the Wisdom Journals, they are all available at wisdom-trek.com. And I encourage you to subscribe to Wisdom Trek on your favorite podcast player so that each day's trek will be downloaded to you automatically. And thank you so much for allowing me to be your guide, your mentor, but most importantly, I am your friend as I serve you through the Wisdom Trek podcast and journal each day. And as we take this trek of life together, let us always live abundantly, love unconditionally, listen intentionally, learn continuously, lend to others generously, lead with integrity, and leave a living legacy each day. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, reminding you to keep moving forward, enjoy your journey, and create a great day every day. See you tomorrow.